A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you so much for tuning into another edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. It is great to have you with us today. Coming up on the program in just a matter of moments, our friend Jim Geraghty is going to be with us from National Review, talking about the latest in the push for gun control in Washington, D.C. Are we going to see anything from President Trump this week, or might this all just sort of fade into the next news cycle? I kind of doubt that's going to happen. I really think the question is, what are we going to see from the president, not if we're going to see anything at all from the president. In the meantime, again, Democrats keeping up the pressure on H.R. 8, the quote-unquote universal background check bill that was already passed out of the House earlier this year, over on the Senate side of things. And they've got more gun control bills queued up and ready to go for full votes in the House over the next few weeks. You've got a hearing on a quote-unquote assault weapons ban measure coming up September 25th as well. Meanwhile, Senator Dianne Feinstein calling for a ban on magazines over 10 rounds. That bill has passed out of a House Judiciary Committee and could be headed for a floor vote in the House before long. So, again, the gun control activists, they still see this as their best opportunity in decades right now to advance their agenda, to get some new gun control laws on the books. At the state level as well, we're looking at lawmakers in Ohio and in Florida that are discussing expanding background checks. In fact, those measures have the support of at least a handful of Republican lawmakers. In Ohio, you've got at least 2 Republicans that are backing expanded background checks, as well as a quote-unquote red flag law. Now, you'd need at least 9 Republicans to support these measures in order for them to get through the Senate in Ohio based on the current makeup. Florida as well, you've got a strong Republican majority, but they had a committee meeting yesterday in which they started talking about some of these measures. No votes are imminent. In fact, probably early next year before this Florida committee actually comes up with any recommendations on how to prevent these types of active assailant attacks, but it is entirely possible that we could be looking at some gun control legislation introduced in Florida as well. Right now, however, I won't say all eyes are on the Senate, but most eyes are on the Senate, and it's what we sat down to talk with our friend Jim Geraghty of National Review about. Also, talking a little bit about Beto O'Rourke's "Hell Yes, We're Coming for Your Guns" moment, and whether or not that's actually going to harm the gun control push right now rather than help it. Take a look and a listen. Well, Jim Geraghty, it's good to hear your voice, sir, and to see your still photographic face there on our computer screens.
Well, thank you for having me on again, Cam. Sorry I can't be with you visually. Just picture me being terribly disfigured at the moment. I'm not, but it just, it seems like a better excuse than I'm having a bad hair day and just not feeling...
I just figured you were in your pajamas, didn't really want to, roll out of bed and get dressed. That's all right. That's fine.
I'm not aesthetically and visually pleasing today.
Listen,
or maybe even less than usual.
Every day is a bad hair day for me, so we're good. That's why you wear the ball cap. All right, so let's talk about a couple of things here. We are waiting to see what, if anything, President Trump will get behind in terms of gun control. Democrats are, at least Democrat leadership, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, out there banging the drum for quote-unquote universal background checks. H.R. 8 has already passed out of the House. Meanwhile, over on the Senate side, though, you've got Senator Joe Manchin, Senator Pat Toomey, and a couple of other folks who are still pushing, universal background check light. It's an expansion of what background checks or where background checks will be required, but it's not quite H.R. 8, the full-blown universal background checks. And I'm curious, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer say if it's anything less than H.R. 8, we're not going to accept it. I think that's absolute nonsense. I think if Donald Trump were to get behind Manchin Toomey, which is, would be the biggest expansion of background checks since the 1990s anyway, I think Democrats, they might, complain, but ultimately they're going to get on board with something like that. Don't you?
Yeah, I think that would probably be the single most intriguing scenario. Look, the dynamics of this are not hard to see. You got a whole bunch of senators on both sides, the Democrats who generally support not just universal background checks, but a whole slew of gun control proposals, which we'll talk about probably in a few minutes. But more importantly, they're out just looking. Something terrible has happened in El Paso. Something terrible has happened in Dayton. We need to do something, and this counts as something. And they want to be able to go back to their home districts and their home states and say, look, I'm as horrified about mass shooters as you are, and thus I did X. And they almost don't even care that much about what X is. They just want to be able to say that they did something. Mm-hmm. And this is, what you said, soft background checks is probably the one that would get the broadest level of support. Probably the least objections from Republicans who consider themselves to be strong Second Amendment supporters. But you're probably not going to find, the issue is that they don't want to sign on unless they're 100% sure the president is going to sign it into law. Because they don't want to get out ahead of their skis, and they don't want to be out seen as, selling out on the gun issue and all that kind of stuff. So they want assurances. And of course, the White House is not yet willing to give assurances. So nobody knows exactly where the president stands on this. And, it can flip around depending on who the president talked to last. But if that did come to pass, the president says, I'm willing to support this soft background checks. Republican senators say, okay, we're willing to support it too. Let's say the Senate passes it, goes back to the House for reconciliation. Boy, that's a fascinating decision for Nancy Pelosi to face. Because if she really sticks by what she's saying now, nope, not good enough. That doesn't address the issue deeply enough. This is a watered-down bill is worse than no bill at all or something like that. Well, then what? She gives every Republican senator a excuse to say, look, I tried to support legislation, and then Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats were obstinate and intransigent and just wouldn't go along with, they were so stubborn, they were so partisan, they wouldn't go along with a bipartisan idea. I think there'd be a bunch of, Republicans would be quite pleased to take that messaging into the 2020 election. Flip side, she could say, you know what, half a loaf is better than none, and you get it passed. The problem is that then it's harder to use that issue in 20 if, God forbid, there's another mass shooting. I mean, you can always go back to the well and say, oh, well, the soft background check bill wasn't enough. We got to do more. But again, most Republicans can say, of course I'm concerned about this. That's why I voted for the soft background check bill of 2019 or whatever they end up calling it. So that's the dynamic there. And my suspicion is that, look, the Democratic House just got elected last term. They really would like to go back home to their districts with a bunch of accomplishments because they haven't exactly been awash in a whole bunch of past legislation so far this year, Cam.
So, and I think that you're right about that in terms of lawmakers really want to just say that they've done something, and what that something is may be less important than actually, just being able to say, look, we did something. To that end, what are the chances that you think President Trump comes out and says, nah, no go on expanded background checks, no go on red flag legislation, and actually gets behind things? Because we've heard, a number of proposals, and none of which, by the way, we've heard from the president himself. So this is all coming from, anonymous sources speaking on background. But some of the things that we've seen, discussed, expediting the death penalty for active assailants. Something that I think would be, I'm curious about. There's been talk about an app that would be developed that private sellers of firearms would use. We don't know if that would be mandatory or voluntary, but it seems like the president is looking at a wide range of things. Not all of them would be objectionable to gun owners and Second Amendment supporters, but there are, I think, several items that, even mentioned to me, look, that's going to tick off the Second Amendment supporters, right? You're going to lose some gun owners there. And so this is sort of the rock and a hard place that the president finds himself between right now, where you're right. There are a lot of lawmakers who say, hey, look, we got to talk to our constituents. We got to tell them we've done something. Meanwhile, the president is looking at, trying to grow his base of support heading into the 2020 elections, not shrink his base of support. And it's easy to say, look, the left's acting crazy. Of course, no gun owner is going to vote for, Beto O'Rourke when he's talking about banning their guns. They're going to vote for Donald Trump, even if he supported, quote unquote, red flag laws. I'm not sure about that. I think then you have to worry about the enthusiasm of gun owners. Do they come out and do they vote in 2020 or do they stay home? I think this is a really, really tricky position that the president has found himself in politically.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Trump has two sometimes very contradictory impulses, and he's not, anybody would have a hard time rectifying them. He has a particularly challenging time. The first one being, these mass shootings are terrible. and I don't want to be seen as doing nothing. I want to be seen as someone who tries to put a stop to it. By golly, I got to do something. On the flip side, you and I have been to the last bunch of NRA conventions. The president has spoken there. The crowd generally adores him when at least the ones who show up. It's usually a full arena there. This has been a really important group, and the NRA's messaging in 2016 was really important for getting out the vote in a whole bunch of those key states. He does not want to alienate gun owners, and you're mentioning back into the fight over Toomey Mansion a couple of years ago. Cam, probably the only time you and I have really vehemently disagreed on air has been over Toomey Mansion, where, one, you kept emphasizing, accurately to me, Jim, it's Toomey Mansion Schumer, because Chuck Schumer was one of the people sponsoring it. I had a warmer and fuzzier feeling towards Pat Toomey, the Republican senator from Pennsylvania who had signed on to this. And I was like, well, look, this guy's got to get reelected. There are a whole bunch of suburbs in Philly. He's got to be competitive. He wants to be seen as somebody who's concerned about gun violence, so he's signing on to this. Gun owners were not impressed with it. Because, again, it's very much in the vein of this is a terrible mass shooting. We have to close the gun show loophole. Did the shooter buy his gun at a gun show? Well, no, but this is doing something. This window dressing. The old anecdote of the drunk looking for his keys under the lamppost because that's where the light is. Actually stopping mass shooters is actually very difficult, but going after gun shows, that's easy. There's kind of a philosophy at heart there. Honestly, you could probably make the argument that Beto O'Rourke made the chances of a compromise on gun legislation tougher in that last presidential debate when he said, heck yeah, we're going to get your guns and we're going to take your AK-47s and we're going to take your AR-15s and all that kind of stuff. Because a huge chunk of this debate, since you and I have, I wrote about this the other day. You and I met in 2004, and we've been, covering and discussing these issues on air and off air for a really long time. We have inevitably had thrown our way, oh, good heavens, you backwater hick paranoid loons. And of course, I quickly point out that, hey, I live in the suburbs. I'm a suburban hick loon, who's paranoid. No one's talking about taking your guns. And of course, then, Beto O'Rourke quite literally comes out and says, heck yes, we're explicitly going to do this. And, not only does it mean that the gun control movement, first of all, it doesn't just matter that Beto said it. The roar of applause in that arena matters because it shows, okay, if there had been awkward silence or only a murmur of applause, you could say, okay, this is a fringe position in the Democratic Party. There isn't really a serious appetite amongst progressives for gun confiscation. No. There was no booing in that hall. Everybody loved it. You look at the polling numbers. Democrats are fine with it. Democrats generally, a big chunk of the Democratic Party agrees with that vote by the San Francisco City Council that the NRA is a domestic terrorist organization. These same people, by the way, Cam, who are support voting rights for felons. And, they want to criminalize the law-abiding and forgive those who have broken the laws, even violent offenders. This is the dynamic here. So if you're a Republican senator, who wants to do something, doesn't want to see no legislation gets passed, wants to seem responsive to these god-awful mass shootings. But the Democrats have just said, this is, what we really want to do is take guns away from people. Boy, I think that makes compromise a heck of a lot tougher. That you start the possibility of, look, maybe this particular legislation you're signing on to isn't that bad, but the other side has made very clear that gun confiscation is their ultimate goal, and that they're just going to see that this is not going to satisfy them. As soon as this gets passed, they're going to start pushing for the next step.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and that's the thing. I would even call Manchin Toomey a compromise because gun owners get nothing out of it. Gun control advocates get half of what they want. Gun owners get zero of what they want. Anti-gun Democrats then turn around and say, look, Donald Trump and the Republicans are beholden to the gun lobby. We couldn't get universal background check laws. They insisted on this watered down measure. No offense, Joe Manchin. And this is why you need to elect Democrats so we can finish the job. I don't think that there is any way you win by playing the gun control game if you are a Second Amendment supporter and if you are somebody who is even interested in, quote unquote, do something that works for goodness sakes. When it comes to quote unquote universal background checks, I wrote about this at Bearing Arms yesterday. John Hickenlooper, who's no longer a presidential candidate, but when he was, that brief window of time, he talked a lot about how he was able to take on the NRA in Colorado. He was able to sign universal background checks into law. He didn't talk about what happened in Colorado after universal background checks were put on the books, because violent crime has gone up in Colorado. In fact, violent crime increased 25% in the state between 2013 and 2018. Denver, Colorado, named the biggest city with the fastest growing crime rate last year. Those things aren't supposed to happen when you put quote unquote universal background check laws on the books. It's supposed to make us safer. Instead, crime's going up in Colorado. So I think there are lots of opportunities for senators and members of Congress who are Second Amendment supporters to say, look, this isn't the way to go about trying to make us safer. All this does is, gives politicians like me an opportunity to put out a press release. It doesn't improve public safety. But you've got to have, A, the political will to do that, and B, you've got to have an alternative. If you're hearing from your constituents, you got to do something, well, then you better have another something to do besides gun control. And that's one area where I've been a little bit disappointed that Republicans have not been offering up a lot of alternatives, at least at the federal level.
Yeah, I was going to say, look, the other thing also is that you should be the word comprehensive is a synonym for all the stuff you don't like tied up with all the stuff you might like. What is much more, interesting to do, okay, let's do a la carte. Let's take each particular provision in this bill and introduce it separately and try to pass it separately, instead of saying, well, look, we know this idea would never get 218 votes in the House all by itself, but we're going to put that one in there. We're going to put this one there because, this one, we never get past 60 votes for a filibuster without this idea. Look, this is how unpopular ideas get passed, as they, like a remora eel, they suction onto a better, more popular idea. And, leadership says, well, you don't have any choice. You're just going to have to vote for the terrible amendment to go with the good bill. And this is how bad ideas become enacted into law. And, I think for a whole bunch of, not just Republican senators, but any senator who wants to be seen as a defender of the Second Amendment, not part of this Beto O'Rourke, let's disarm Americans campaign, you can't say, you got to have a tough line. And no, we're not enacting the bad idea to go along with the good idea. In theory, you and I have talked about red flag laws in the past, and I think everybody loves the broad concept of, if somebody's a danger to themselves or others, getting guns out of their home. The objections of the NRA and other gun supporters of, like, okay, once you've done that, that doesn't mean the threat went away. The guy still wants to harm himself. The guy still wants to harm others. He's still got knives. He's still got a car. He's still got all kinds of different ways in which he could do harm to anyone or anyone else. You probably should do something about that. And, oh, by the way, does this include due process? Because anything you do, that, any mechanism of law can be abused by somebody, right? Somebody could say, I had a fight with my neighbor. He's always been a jerk. I know he's got a gun. I'm going to file that he's, I'm going to claim that he's, making threats and acting like a nut or something like that. Any mechanism you have there, you want the idea of somebody who is wrongfully accused of being a threat to themselves or others has a chance to defend themselves. And, the NRA's got a fair argument when they say, look, this is fine in theory. We've got to think about how this is going to work in practice, and how are we ensuring due process and the rights of the accused. Because in effect, you're being accused of a crime. In fact, you're getting accused of a pre-crime.
Right. You're not even, you're not being accused of a crime. You're being accused of potentially being capable of committing a crime, right? And so in New Jersey, they just had their red flag law go into effect September the 1st. It's been used on average at least once a day since then. And some of the details, as I was looking into New Jersey's red flag law, is completely open-ended. There is no expiration date. A judge can, keep this red flag law in place in perpetuity, in essence. And the standard for having a red flag is basically a preponderance of the evidence. 51%, a judge says, I think he's more likely than not this person is a danger to themselves or others. You lose your rights. That's a red flag in and of itself to me. And I think that you're right, that there are a lot of gun owners out there who look at these red flag laws and say, okay, why would this be more appropriate or better than the existing civil commitment laws or the existing criminal justice system. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of talk about due process protections. Doesn't seem to, in New Jersey, again, there's no provision for anybody filing a false report or a malicious report. There's no punishment, no punitive measures taken. So you do set up a system that I think is, if not ripe for abuse, certainly able to be abused. And I think that those are genuine concerns. Any federal bill that we're likely to see would not set up any sort of federal red flag provision, but it would empower states through federal grants to put these laws on their books. And so I think it would be, personally, I've not seen any red flag law that I support that I think has enough due process protections. But I'm really concerned that any restrictions that the federal government might place on these states that establish these red flag laws would not go nearly far enough to protect the due process rights of those individuals, nor protect against that sort of malicious harassment that you just talked about. Again, all of this is a theoretical exercise right now because we don't know what the president might be willing to support or when he might come out and say something. To that end, I guess, one quick question for you before we talk about Beto for a minute. Is the window of opportunity closing on gun control? If the president doesn't say anything this week, if he, just decides, I'm just going to try to ride out this news cycle, is that possible? Or does something have to be said and done?
No, I think you're right. Time is generally on the side of the status quo. The more time that goes by that you don't see a presidential statement saying, I am willing to support X, Y, and Z in federal legislation, the more likely it is that nothing will happen. But then again, there's a flip side, which is that God forbid some other Yahoo decides to go out and shoot a whole bunch of people. You'll see the calls for this happen all over again. And it's this, two competing forces at work here. The force of chaos of these things happening, and everybody, left, right, and center saying, God, what's wrong with these kids? These kids who are into Columbiners, the incels, all these angry young men with their manifestos who get it into their head of, I feel disenchanted and alienated, and I'm angry at the world. So this is how I deal with it. I don't, go hit a punching bag or try to, prove myself in life. Can't do that. No. The only thing I can do is, try to commit a massacre. That's how I'll be remembered forever. That happens, and it's completely, look, I think if you don't think, oh my God, how can we prevent this? There's probably something wrong with you. But having said that, it's the same thing as all the other, capacity bans and other pieces of legislation you've covered over the years, Cam. The quicker you write the legislation, the sloppier it's going to be. The more, was it upstate New York where they ended up banning cops' guns because they'd written the legislation so loosely or something?
Say that again?
Sure. There was a piece of legislation, it might have been New York after Sandy Hook or something like that, where they wrote it and passed it so fast, they didn't realize that they had actually in the process banned the guns that cops carried with them.
Well, they had banned magazines. This was part of the New York Safe Act. They banned magazines that could hold more than 7 rounds. And then they had to go back and they had to exempt law enforcement. And then they had to go back eventually and they realized, shoot, nobody makes 7-round magazines. So they actually had to change the law. Without changing the law, they just reinterpreted the existing law and said, okay, now you can have a 10-round magazine, but you can only have 7 rounds of ammunition in it. And there are a number of counties in New York State that don't even enforce that law because it is so difficult and impractical to enforce. There was also a measure that part of the SAFE Act, same piece of legislation, that required the New York State Police to conduct background checks on every ammunition purchase. They haven't been able to figure out how to do that. So they've just kind of quietly dropped that provision, which drives it. I'm glad you brought that up. This is a sore subject with me, Jim, because it does drive me crazy to see bad laws put on the books, and then the politicians who are responsible for those bad laws then just decide, rather than try to fix the bad law, or better yet, get rid of the bad law, they just keep the bad law on the books, and they just ignore the parts that are particularly complicated or too difficult because they don't want to acknowledge their failure. And that's exactly what's happened in New York State.
And this should be, ideally, this would be a very well-known cautionary tale, Sam, of why you're not, when something terrible happens, do something shouldn't be your rallying cry, because when your thing is not do the appropriate response that is carefully considered over time and measured and citing experts and looking at actual human behavior, that's a long rallying cry. I understand why people don't go to a rally and chant that. But do something, well, then you get something. And something might be good, something might be bad. And in this case, it's a very sloppily written law that has all kinds of unforeseen consequences the lawmakers didn't foresee because they're already thinking about the great press release they're going to write on
exactly
how terrific they are.
All right, listen, I've been keeping you a long time, but I want to ask you one more question before we let you go. And let's go back to Beto for a second. Beto O'Rourke, not the first candidate to call for a ban and a quote-unquote buyback of semi-automatic firearms. That was Eric Swalwell, who, again, is no longer in the presidential race whatsoever. I've seen one poll that's come out since the debate last Thursday where Beto said, hell yes, we're coming for your guns. Before the debate, Beto was at 3% in the morning consult poll. He has climbed to 4% in the morning consult poll post-debate. This poll has a 1-point margin of error, so it's entirely possible that Beto O'Rourke has seen no gain. Do you think that other candidates are going to jump on this bandwagon? Pete Buttigieg has said, this was bad. We've got this moment here where we could get gun control through the Senate, and Beto's blowing it up by talking about banning guns. But let's say a month, 2 months from now, when presumably Congress has moved on from this issue one way or the other, do you think it is likely that we will see more candidates come out and actually take the Beto Swalwell position of, yes, we're going to ban these guns and we're going to take them from you?
Yeah, not for a little while, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen as we look. Eventually, this teeming crowd of candidates is going to thin even further, and this is a pretty strong argument to be made that in reality it's down to three. It's down to Biden, Sanders, or Warren. Kamala Harris is sinking like a stone. Buttigieg can wow the donors, but isn't he's still at 5 to 6% in most of these polls. And we all know that, it'd be tough to picture, say, Joe Biden saying, yes, I'm going to promote gun confiscation. We all know Joe Biden's preferred plan for home security: stick your shotgun out the door, pull the trigger, and hope for the best. And lo and behold, that's not actually the home defense that is recommended by many security experts. But anyway, but here's the thing. Let's say, it's sometime late winter, early spring, and it's down to Biden versus Warren or Biden versus Sanders or something like that. And, it's getting tough. I could see a Warren or a Sanders jumping on board with that idea, thinking it'll give them that little extra boost amongst the progressive activists that they need. I don't think it would work. And I think the fact that, Beto O'Rourke has that whopping 1% change, I hope it was worth it to him, blowing up the messaging from the gun control advocates for the past couple of decades, But this is, my guess is that whether or not, it's been absolutely fascinating. Other than a little bit here and there, maybe you could say Steve Bullock is trying with this. Turns out Seth Moulton's camp was a candidate for president. No one noticed him. He got lost in the crowd. But there have been occasional guys who have recognized, and I actually had to tout my own stuff. I had a piece earlier this week called Inside the Mind of the Biden Voter. And it's very much not attempting to mock these people. It's very much my talking and listening to people who are supporters of Joe Biden and kind of getting into their thinking. There are Democrats who don't want a socialist revolution. There are Democrats who don't want to turn everything in society upside down. Generally, they were kind of happy with the Obama era, and they're not. They probably broadly support gun control, but you could see there are Democrats out there for whom gun confiscation strikes them as a bridge too far. And it's really been, obviously there are registered Democrats who own guns, plenty of them in this country. The fact that so few Democratic candidates want to even court that demographic, I think is fascinating and kind of an interesting miscalculation there. And again, what Beto O'Rourke does is that when a Joe Biden type says, we're not going to take your guns, look, we saw the reaction in that hall to Beto O'Rourke. Biden may not want to at any particular given moment, but if push comes to shove and a Democratic House passes it and a Democratic Senate passes it, I don't see, how comfortable do you feel with President Joe Biden being the last line of defense for your Second Amendment rights?
Not comfortable at all. And, given if Biden is president, who knows who the vice president would be, but I'd say as bad as Biden is on guns, his vice presidential pick likely to be exponentially worse. Jim Geraghty from National Review. As always, sir, it is great talking with you. I appreciate you sitting down with us today.
Always enjoy it, Cam.
All right. Hopefully we get a chance to do this in person again before long. Make sure you're reading Jim Geraghty at National Review. And thanks for joining us here on Bearing Arms Cam & Company. Let's turn our attention now to an armed citizen story. We've got a good deed of the day for you. And, of course, we've got a career criminal who's causing problems, this time in New Orleans, Louisiana, where the DA is actually speaking out about this individual, Leonard Preston. He's 49 years old. He is a career criminal. The DA says he's actually been sentenced previously to life in prison, but was able to get out from behind bars. He says this is an individual who's been in the criminal justice system since he was 12 years old. And Leon Canizaro, who's the DA there in New Orleans, says, again, this guy, Leonard Preston, keeps causing problems. Most recently, he is accused of committing a home invasion last week in the city of New Orleans. The victim in this case, according to Fox 8, says he told me to sit down and if I moved, he would do something to me. I sat there and I heard him rummaging through my apartment. He asked me where the money was. I told him I didn't have any money. He told me to be quiet. So he ended up allegedly stealing the victim's phone instead. Police were able to use that phone to track Preston. The DA, Canizaro, says he's not surprised that Leonard Preston will return to crime. He says absolutely not. This is an individual that the community must and should be protected from. 37 years of a criminal history. Canizaro said Preston's criminal history, quote, reaches the pinnacle in December and January of 1996 and 1997 when he's involved in armed robberies, aggravated burglaries, and other crimes. 4 separate crimes involving 6 victims. And that's when a judge sentenced him to life in prison as a habitual offender back in 1997. Canizaro says he goes before the parole board seeking to get out of jail. This office opposed his parole. We indicated that, in our opinion, he was still a danger to the community, and we objected and strongly opposed that parole being given to him. Well, didn't matter. The board still granted him parole in January of 2018. Here we are less than 2 years later. And as the DA says, he is up to the same sort of criminal activity again. Now, our armed citizen story from the great state of Texas, where a drive-in theater manager ended up having to defend herself from a would-be robber who ended up beating her with a baseball bat. This is an incredibly scary situation here. In the tiny town of Hockley, Texas, deputies got a call to the Showboat Drive-In about 2:30 in the morning. Harris County Sheriff's Office says that 2 managers were closing up for the night when they spotted something moving inside the concession stand. So one of the managers went to go check it out. Turns out there was a guy inside, 2 guys actually. One of them with a baseball bat began beating that manager. She was able to draw her firearm and shot and killed the suspect who was beating her while the second suspect took off. It looks like she's going to be okay. That second suspect, police are still looking for, but again, an incredibly scary situation. You think you're just, packing up at the end of the night, ready to go home and get some sleep, and all of a sudden the next thing you know, you are being attacked and forced to defend yourself. It's an incredibly scary situation. We'll hopefully be able to give you any more details as they become available. And our good deed of the day from, it's kind of from 2 places, actually, from Glendale, Arizona, and Fort Myers, Florida. But I think the story actually starts in Glendale, Arizona. WINK News with the story of a police officer there in Glendale, Sergeant Jeff Turney, who definitely went above and beyond the call of duty in helping a 94-year-old man. It all started with a phone call to police dispatch. This 94-year-old's daughter called police and said, I have a 94-year-old father. He's loaded up a trailer, and he thinks that he can drive his vehicle and trailer to Florida, and I'd like to have somebody talk to him if they could. So police went out to the home of 94-year-old Howard Benson. Sergeant Jeff Tooney says, I walked in the door, I saw him sitting there, I said, we're not going to talk any sense into this guy. And nope, you weren't. Howard Benson says, I had my mind made up. I was going to do it. 2,200 miles from Glendale, Arizona to an assisted living facility in Fort Myers, Florida. His kids all live out of town. They were just telling him, Dad, pack up your stuff, fly, just ship the stuff you want to take with you. You don't need to drive. But Howard says, I'm stubborn. And when Sergeant Turney realized that there was no way he was going to convince Howard to get into an airplane instead of a vehicle. He decided, all right, I'm going to help this guy. So he started coming over after work and would pack up the trailer. Howard at one point asked Sergeant Turney, "Are you going to find somebody to drive me to Florida?" And Sergeant Turney said, "No, Howard, I don't think I can get anybody to go with you, but how about I drive?" So the next day, Sergeant Turney requested vacation time, took that time off, got behind the wheel of the car, had 94-year-old Howard as his passenger, and they drove the 2,200 miles from Arizona to Florida. WII says along the way they talked about everything from Howard's service in the Navy during World War II to his anxiety about moving into assisted living. Sergeant Turney, when they got to Florida, said that he would stay until Howard felt comfortable in his new surroundings. That's amazing. Howard says, "I've never seen a person so dedicated to helping people in my life. I can't thank that gentleman enough." And boy, you know, we talk a lot about being in the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. This is truly extraordinary. I don't know too many folks who would do what Sergeant Jeff Turney did there in Glendale, Arizona, but in the right place, at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. And we thank you, Sergeant, for your good deed out there. And I imagine you got some pretty great stories along the way. That has got to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. Thank you so much for being a part of today's program. You can find us in podcast form at Apple Podcasts, on Stitcher, and on Spotify, as well as townhall.com podcasts. You can subscribe on YouTube to Town Hall Media as well. And we'll be back tomorrow with the very latest Second Amendment news and information from all across the nation. Thanks so much for being a part of today's program.